What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper. After I mentioned in my hot takes video that there were a lot of top-level brewers who were succeeding at the top end of Infinite with off-meta decks, a lot of people said, hey, KM, you should have those brewers on. And I used to do an interview series, so we're bringing it back. This is episode 1 of Underrated Decks, aka Why I'm Wrong About X. Today, we're going to have BigBaby on, a routine top 50 competitor. His name in game is Fartober. Yes, it is currently November, and his name is out of date. Take it up with him. You will be able to find him all over the leaderboard. He's been as high as 5th in the entire world, and he is known for playing things that are completely off meta. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at his Mr. Negative list, which he has been incredibly successful with. Mr. Negative, traditionally a deck that I am not a big fan of. So let's see what BigBaby, the first of our featured brewers, has to say about it. I am joined by BigBaby, who has shown a remarkable ability to get to high ranks on the Marvel Snap ladder with what I would term the worst decks of all time. I mentioned this in a previous video, and I got a lot of comments that were like, yo, KM, why don't you show us some of those decks? Why don't you have these off-meta brewers on the show? And here I am. I'm doing that. I'm having an off-meta brewer on the show. BigBaby, welcome to the show. We're here to talk about your Mr. Negative deck, with which you have played way more games than anyone should ever have played, and with which you've had more success than anyone should ever have had.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I told my wife, and she just rolled her eyes, as she does whenever I tell her about this game. The higher my rank goes, the angrier she gets. So now that I'm being interviewed on a YouTube channel without getting any financial compensation, she's even more thrilled. So it's really great.
When I was doing this kind of stuff, my girlfriend just loved it when I would, take time out of my day to make no money. She loved it. It was a huge thing that she was like, she loved it so much. Okay. So all that said, all seriousness, I do want to talk about the Marvel Snap deck that you have been playing. That's this weird Mr. Negative Ravonna thing. I have seen multiple players in the top end be like, I really need to pick up Ravonna for this BigBaby cook. Walk me through what the deck does at a basic level.
So at a basic level, you have kind of two things that you're trying to do. The first thing that you're absolutely trying to do, like it's your first, second, and third plan, is get out Mr. Negative and then do something stupid and broken.
Okay.
Essentially with your inverted cards. Like that's like the main Mr. Negative game plan. Now, Mr. Negative has gone through like a few different versions. Like the old Negative that I know Jeff Hoagland used to play a lot had Angela, who died, had Bishop, who's not dead, but has just been drastically outclassed by other scaling threes, namely Werewolf. And it had Sarah and Blue Marvel. And that stuff just seems a little too small bowl right now. And you're playing against really good players who are better than me at the upper levels of High Infinite. We're playing decks that just put out a ton of power, and then if you're counting on like an inverted Bishop or a 3/5 Blue Marvel, that's just not really going to do a lot, especially because they'll probably get your Blue Marvel, and it may be not an inverted Blue Marvel, but it may cost 3 just the same. So I think Mr. Negative now has to just be like the greediest piece of crap imaginable to kind of keep up right now, because you have the various werewolf shells, which put out a ton of power, especially Loki. And Loki can rip some of your cards too to make it even crazier. So the only way for like Mr. Negative to ever compete is by going greed mode, like inverted Iron Man, inverted Darkhawk, Null, Zola stuff. Ripping, using Jane to grab 3 or 4 of them. Otherwise, you're just not doing anything that's nearly powerful enough. If you're doing kind of an older Negative shell with Blue Marvel or Bishop or Wolfsbane, it's not worth it, because you're already playing Mr. Negative. You're already playing like a fringe viable deck. So if you're going to play it, you need to like actually do something that is broken.
Okay.
So
I want to stop you there, because I have a couple questions about like the various packages, and I think we're going to delve into those naturally in that answer anyway. So
Yeah,
I do want to say that this deck looks like it's constructed out of like multiple different decks, right?
yeah,
Like there is the Darkhawk deck that's in here, there is the Negative Jane deck that's in here, and then they overlap in terms of support with Zabu and Ravona working with both of them.
yeah.
And then there's like Mystique, Iron Man. Mystique works with Darkhawk. Mystique also works with your stupid Iron Man stuff, right? Like there's a little bit of overlap in that sense. So like there's a couple cards I wanted to ask about specifically we'll get to later, but generally speaking, how often are you a Mr. Negative deck and how often are you scraping by as a non-negative deck?
So because of Jane, you can get away with a turn 4 Mr. Negative and a turn 5 Jane and be in the game. You have to manage your hand size because it doesn't do any good to like not play any cards, have 6 cards in your hand when you play Jane, and then Jane draws 1 card. Like that's not going to do it.
Yeah.
So sometimes you're like playing a tempo Ironheart just to get it out of your hand. So if you get to do the Jane stuff, you at least have something of a plan. But I do think, I mean, the main game plan with this deck is definitely Mr. Negative. Like you can get a 10 power Darkhawk and then copy it with Mystique, and you have 2 10 power bodies and maybe an Iron Man. So you're not completely dead in the water, but if you like if you're not doing Mr. Negative stuff, this deck is just not good. Like
Okay,
you can
so
get away with it.
yeah. Talk me through the snap and retreat then. Like when are
Snap.
you
All right. So
snapping? Because like that feels like the only thing that matters in a deck like this. Like what
that's
are
this
your
is a
various snap conditions?
this is a snapping deck. That's really what this is. Because like most people, if they get if they play Jane and they draw 4, 5, 0, 6, 0, 5 cards with backbreaking abilities, they can pull off a win. Um, Base case, I mean, so there's varying degree of good hands.
Okay.
The best possible hand is you play negative on 3 and you have Jane in your hand. You have to snap that. Like there is no world on earth where you don't snap that. That is the thing you're doing. Generally, I snap if I get Mr. Negative on 3. Even if I don't have the best negative hand, even if I might draw like shit, like you can't play Mr. Negative and play Mr. Negative on 3 and not snap. Now you have to be a little less confident in your snap, and this is not only a deck about snapping, it's also a deck that teaches you when you snap and then when you gotta go. And a lot of people think that it's like raising in poker, like you raise and then the flop's no good, and then you're like, okay, I'm dead. That happens. But you were right to raise.
Yeah.
This is that kind of deck where I'm doing the thing. Don't if you're playing a deck that does a thing and you're doing the thing, you gotta snap it. And if it turns out that then your negative draws are bad, that's life. But otherwise, this is a deck that retreats for 1 all the time. So you need to up the stakes every time you can to make up for the retreat for ones.
So
So my
there's a little bit about this deck that strikes me when I think about it, which is like, okay, so you are a deck that needs to snap your Mr. Negatives. How bad does your hand have to be to make him not a snap? Like if your hand is like Iron Man, Dark Hawk, Mystique, Ironheart, and you have no Jane, are you still snapping him knowing that the only things in the deck are like, well, I guess you have Zola Null then. Like, so let's say your hand is Zola Null, Iron Man, Darkhawk. Are you still snapping a turn 3 Mr. Negative?
ugh, it's hard.
Yeah.
It depends on what the matchup is. Like if you're already a dog in the matchup, like you're going against Loki, and you have like a very mid Mr. Negative, you probably shouldn't snap it. Um, Especially if things that if like a lot of the people playing at the top are playing decks, or if you're going into like the bounce decks, because you may not draw
Yeah.
at all with Widow's Bites, and Jane can search through Widow's Bites, so she doesn't really care. But if you're playing Mr. Negative versus Darkhawk Bounce or any other variety of Werewolf Bounce, where they're going to cut you off of 1, maybe 2 draws, which is, I mean, obviously in a Mr. Negative deck, I don't need to say it's backbreaking. Um, so matchup dependent, but so against those kind of decks, I probably would just play Mr. Negative, like the least confident Mr. Negative,
Yeah.
the world's ever seen, and then like maybe I can scam an extra cube if I get the good cubes. It turns out I still get a good enough nut draw, and they snap into me, and maybe I can actually get the equity that I otherwise wouldn't from snapping early on negative.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a line. I try to be more aggressive just because like if you wait along for the perfect Mr. Negative hand, like you're already pushing a deck that lives on the margins, and you're reducing it to like a 1 out of 8, a 1 out of like a 25% chance where you'll even get to play. So I still try to be aggressive. Um, but yeah, I mean when you have like likely bad draws in your negative deck and or a bad matchup, you can't. You want to. You feel embarrassed playing Mr. Negative on 3 and not snapping. Just like when people Professor X on 4 and they don't snap, and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, you got me. But I mean, sometimes you do it, just have to do it.
Yep. Like it's one of those things where like the heuristic is you just always snap when you do this, and then there's like hands where it's actually impossible to do. And it's very
Yeah,
frustrating when you run into those kind of situations, but it's important to
yeah,
identify them so you don't end up throwing away even more cubes, because more
yeah,
than just being aggressive on your good hands, you have to actually be able to identify your good hands.
yeah.
I want to ask about matchups. You mentioned Loki, Darkhawk, Bounce, especially as matchups you aren't super excited to see. That's a little bit surprising to me because I feel like this deck would probably be pretty decent into Loki. So walk
No,
me
no, no.
through how the Loki
Yeah,
matchup looks.
no, no, no. Loki, I'm fine with. If I'm doing my thing, I will go 8 Qs with Loki any day of the week. And if it
Okay.
doesn't work out, that's fine. But I will do it. Like Loki, I mean, so I'll talk. I think we'll probably talk about this later. But like, they can have an Iron Man and a Mystique. My 0-5 Iron Man
Right.
is exponentially better than their 5-0 Iron Man. Even if it costs 3 for them, it's a 0-5 Iron Man's the best card in the game. Like the best single card that you play, not like where, but like it can't compete. So if I'm doing my thing, Loki can't keep up. It just
That's what I
can't.
thought. Yeah.
Um, and that's really one of the main reasons I play this. We'll talk about this more, but so I had a game against a very good player, better than me. They've been on this. They've won tournaments, and we went 8 cubes, and I had like the absolute stone cold nuts, and I wound up turn 6. I shanged and Zola'd on the same turn, and I just wiped the board while also playing 0-5 Iron Man, 0-3 Mystique. Like it's just it's chess. It's not chess for checkers. This deck is checkers. It's just like when you're doing your thing, Loki can't stop you. The bounce decks can stop you because they have Black Widow,
Yeah.
and Black Widow is the last card you ever want to see when you're playing this deck, unless you have Jane, because you just won't draw. And then you're just a negative deck trying to draw inverted cards and instead getting completely shit on.
So
And
hold on. I want to stop you on the bounce thing right there, because if you're a bounce deck, is the advice here then save your Black Widow for after Mr. Negative unless you have a beast? Or is it just you should try to hit it on like both? Like you should try to hit it on like turn 3 and also on turn 5. Like the idea would be if they have like a Zabu or Ravona out, you go for the Black Widow on 3, you bounce it, you hit it on turn 5 as well.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard read to make on ladder.
Hmm.
If we were doing conquest, I would say absolutely. Like there have been times where I play Mr. Negative on 3 and I get Black Widowed on 3, and I'm just like, that's funny. I'm dead, right? And
Yeah.
so you know, if like, your first thought when you see Zabu on 2 is not, oh, they're a
Yeah.
Mr. Negative
It's not
deck.
Mr. Negative. Yeah.
And honestly, even when you see Ravona, people are playing Ravona with goblins. The very, very smart people are playing Ravona with goblins and Galactus, which was my favorite deck last season. Um, which is much worse into bounce now because obviously they can just pick up the goblins.
Yeah.
Um,
It's an issue.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, if we're playing Conquest and it looks like, and like I snap on 2 and you have Black Widow, you would absolutely hold it on 3 and then just annihilate me on turn 3 with a Black Widow. But
Sounds
on ladder,
reasonable.
it's like, you know, no, very few people are playing Mr. Negative. So
Yeah. I mean, now when people see you and you play a Zabu, they're going to know, which means you need to play a different deck. Which actually brings me to a different kind of question, which is you're someone who likes cooking a lot. And the first
yeah,
thing you said when I got on this call was, can I talk about how hard it is to cook a new deck in an environment like this? And so I wanted to just give you go nuts. This is your time to talk about that.
Yeah. So this has been like the hardest season for me to cook. Now, part of that is self-inflicted because I've like pumped, I don't know, 100, 150, maybe more SP trying to make Spectrum work because the Peach Momoko Spectrum, I think, is the best variant in the game. It's just stunning, and she's so bad. She is so bad because you can't even play her in Thanos because the Thanos has basically been gutted because
Yeah,
it's not the best scam deck anymore because of Miss Marvel,
yeah,
and you're not a Miss Marvel deck. Loki still is way better than you most of the time because you can't really play Mobius.
yep.
So Spectrum, I've just tried and tried, and it stinks. Every permutation just stinks. Like it's kind of funny. Like Werewolf, you can just play a bunch of cheap on reveal ones, and you're like, haha, I'm winning the game. And then Spectrum, you're playing like cheap ongoings, and you're just like, oh, I put 7 power on the board.
Well,
This doesn't do it.
it's like it's different, right? It's like with Werewolf, it's like you're playing a bunch of cheap on reveals and you're like, I'm winning the game. And it's like, yeah, from a 3 drop, not a 6, right? Like
Yeah, I know.
it's like, that 7 power would be very, very impressive if you were adding 7 power to a 3 drop, right? Like that's pretty
Yeah,
good, right? But instead it's a 7 power 6 drop, and you're just like,
yeah.
oh, okay, well, that sucks.
And it's just so. I mean, the meta in our area of the pool is defined by Loki. Like you have
Yeah,
Loki, you have Werewolf bounce decks, which includes Loki, but there's other ones.
yeah.
And then after that, you have something like Destroy, which kind of just does its own thing. You don't really need a metagame around Destroy. And then you
I don't know
have
if that's true.
right
I,
now. I mean, you have to be conscious of Killmonger if you're playing like a bounce deck.
You have to be conscious of
But like,
Killmonger, and like some decks are Cosmo decks because a Destroy pushes them in that direction, I think.
yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. It does increase the viability or the usefulness of Cosmo.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have like Lockdown.
Yeah.
Um, and this is a tangent, but like every time I get super frustrated with Loki, I'm like, oh, what would the meta be without Loki? I think it would just be Lockdown, which would be even worse. So it's kind of like,
I mean, I don't
I
even think
guess
the
Loki.
lockdown decks are there. You know what I mean? Like,
No, I know, but I think if Loki didn't exist,
they might
it would
be,
just
yeah.
be it would be a Lockdown meta.
But they do have
Um,
the issue of just like they're just decks that play good cards in it. And so,
well, they're dead until it's like high evolution wave. It's
yeah,
like
it's that. Yeah.
you're dead into Loki, but you can farm other decks that try to beat Loki.
Hmm.
Like unless you hit the scam nuts, it's just not. But so so right now you're getting you get compressed by Loki no matter what you do. Like it is a very difficult puzzle to solve when it represents so many of your games and it's being played by really good players who are only getting better with Loki. And like most of the players I play are better than me and they're just getting better and better with Loki. And it just I mean you're like, "Oh, that's a good card." Oh, but it's even worse it's worse if Loki gets it. So then
Yeah.
it kind of squeezes you. So you can play decks that have no good cards, like a Cerebro 2 or a Cerebro 3, which they do their thing. Cerebro 3 is still probably the best deck into Loki. Um, and then outside of that, it's really just it gets harder and harder, especially because you have to contend with lockdown decks. And then which are just generally annoying. And then the bounce decks now are super disruptive. Like
Yeah.
I think the Darkhawk deck is better than the kind of Dara Gladiator deck. But the Dara Gladiator deck has Doc Ock, and Doc Ock really can mess up your day. It's a great card right now. It's a really strong
Yeah,
card right
that's
now.
the real threat of it. Like those bounce decks are getting at you one way or the other, where they're either Black
Yeah,
Widowing you or they're Doc Ocking you, and you have to be able to play through that disruption.
right. So it's really just I don't know. Like a couple seasons ago, I made Human Torch bounce work for a little,
Mm.
and I made some Storm decks work for a bit, and I had the Ravonna Darkhawk deck with Galactus last season, which was really good into the Thanos matchups because you get the free boost to your Darkhawk, and they fill the board up so you could like get a guaranteed Galactus lane, and it was hilarious and fun. But now it's really bad now. Um, so I just you try to do all these things, but at the end of the day, you need to put good cards in your deck to win.
This is coming
But you
from a
need to
guy
do it.
playing Mr. Negative.
Well, that's the thing. It has to be asymmetric.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and one of the only ways to get asymmetry, is inverting your deck,
Yeah.
right? That gives you asymmetry. It makes your Iron Man is 5-0, mine is 0-5.
Yeah.
Even if you get it for 4-0, mine's 0-5. And like this deck is you hinted at it before. It's a lot of disparate parts. And I always thought that Jane Negative was just a meme,
Yeah.
right? Like you have a null in here, you don't destroy anything. You have a Dark Hawk in here. I added Rock Slide, so it wasn't completely the stupidest Dark Hawk in history.
Yeah.
And and my one of my general principles for Mr. Negative decks is you need to maximize the amount of banger hits you get when you when you get Mr. Negative on 3. And I see people playing Mr. Negative decks where they just have too many bad hits. Like someone on ladder recently, they're a good player, but they've been running a version with Sarah, and it's like you don't want to get a 4 or 5 Sarah. That is not winning you a game right now.
Yeah, that's real
So
bad.
like, Rock Slide is not a good negative hit, but it's not the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world is Jane. A
Yes.
negative Jane is literally unplayable.
No, she's not
And
anymore. I mean, like, yeah, she is. She costs 6, but
yeah,
whatever.
right. She's
Like,
6.
you
If
can
your
play
turn
her.
6 is yeah, exactly. Um, so like, but Rock Slide at least gives you a backbone to scam your way out of non-negative games or to add power in ways that they may not expect. Like I've won some games with negative where I didn't have a great draw, where I Zola'd my Rock Slide, which sounds really strange,
It
but
does.
it really does. It juices the hell out of your Darkhawks,
Yeah.
and then it's not like the ideal, but like Rock Slide gives you ballast that even if you're kind of eating it on the chin because you're not drawing 0-5 Iron Man, it's not like Bast. Like when you draw Bast in a Mr. Negative deck as one of your negative draws, you're dead.
Yeah.
If you draw turn 6 Magic, you're dead. And you'll see I don't have Magic in here. One, because it's a Darkhawk deck. But two, Magic, it's especially when you're playing so much Loki, it's just a kick me sign. It's please snow guard me, please snow guard hawk me on turn 6. Like I want to lose 8 cubes when the game ends a turn before I think it does.
Yeah. No, that's
Um,
100% accurate.
and like I got a player who was playing Mr. Negative when I was playing Loki once, where I had Rogue in hand, so I showed him that I had Hawk, so I knew that they would dump their hand,
Right. And
and
then
then
you force them. Yes.
I let them dump their hand, and then I just stole their Iron Man, and then
Yeah,
I
like
won.
that's the worst thing about the Magic Snow Guard interaction is like better players will just be like, I'm not gonna Snow Guard this. I know you know I have
Yeah,
it. You're
right,
gonna do your stuff, and then I'm gonna win the turn 7. Congratulations on
exactly,
filling up the board. All right, Big
right.
Baby. It has been a pleasure. Do you have any final messages for our audience?
Oh wait, you just cut out there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Big Baby.
Oh,
I was doing the outro. I was like
okay,
I was doing a thing. I'm leaving this in.
got it.
Big Baby. Do you have any final messages for our audience? Anything you want to say? Any shout outs you want to give to yourself? Shout outs you want to give to various cards? What you got for me?
Yeah, I like to shout out Oteon for being the easiest cubes on ladder. He helps me keep my rank up when I'm doing bad cooks. I'm obviously just teasing. No, I empathize with anyone who feels it's frustrating to play off meta right now, but I still recommend it because it does teach you a lot about the game and what makes things good and how to come up with your own decks and why other decks are good and why decks that already exist are good. And it just kind of helps you figure out how the pieces fit. Now, I'm saying that in full recognition that this deck, Mr. Negative, is just like an amalgamation of cards slammed together that are broken if they're inverted. Like there's not a lot of deck building like theory crafting going to this where someone's like, "Oh, this is super clever." This is this is like the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like it's not the worst I've ever seen, but it's the dumbest. This is a stupid deck.
Yeah.
But cooking is, I think, for me, the most fun part of this game. Um, I wish it was a little bit easier than it was right now. But when you actually do come up with something, like it is pretty fun and rewarding. And when you're playing people who are better than you, which is what I generally do, like doing something that they don't expect, like good players know how to beat Loki in a Loki mirror. And if I'm playing Tenjo or Eva, or if Dara's playing Loki or you're playing Loki, I'm not really favored in that matchup. Even though, like, part of it's just like who gets Loki. Like, I'm just not as good at it. But if I'm doing something weird and unexpected, that gives me a leg up that I don't ordinarily have. And I know you shouted out Yo Woody and Cleanup and Husky, and I think also Derek. Derek's even better than me. He's like often when he plays like in the top 10, and his decks are the most insane things I've ever seen. Um, so I just wanted to shout them out as also similar
Hell
weird
yeah.
brewers. And just stay weird and don't get too frustrated when Loki rips your entire deck and does it better than you in a single turn. Um, I'm just kidding. Like, get really mad about that because it sucks and I'm tired
Yeah,
of
get
it.
mad online and make sure you
Exactly.
at everyone. All right, Big
Exactly.
Baby, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. It was awesome, and I love you.
Whoa, damn. Okay.